Mutta nyt, now, the floor is yours, Nigel Farage, the group leader of the Europe for Freedom and Democracy. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I'm pleased to see lots of people here tonight. And I thank especially Timo Soini for his kind invitation to ask me to come along. We worked together for 20 months in the European Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg. I'm a bit of a veteran of the Parliament. I've been there for nearly 12 years, so I think I know the ropes. And it was very kind of Timo to say that I'm one of the best speakers in the European Parliament. A very nice, kind compliment, to which I have to respond, it's not difficult, because there isn't much competition, really, is there? You see, what has happened within the European Union, what has happened, in fact, across our Western democracies, is there has been a takeover of the bureaucrats. Dull, grey people who, when they speak, unlike Timo and I, they don't speak from the heart, they don't speak with passion or conviction, they speak, frankly, for their wallet. Because they are in this for a career, they know that the European Union is the best thing that's ever happened to bureaucrats and career politicians, and I guess we do make a fairly striking contrast against them. I've noticed over the 20 months we've been together in the Europe for Freedom and Democracy Group, and with Timo operating as chairman of the bureau of our group, his honesty, his straightforward manner, and of course his great sense of humour. And he's shown that sense of humour by inviting me here to Helsinki in February. Although I have to say, it was a rather nice afternoon. When I'm not doing politics, I'm a great sea angling fan. But I have to say, having seen the lakes this afternoon, the idea of drilling a hole and sitting next to it for the afternoon is something that I will on this particular trip pass up. But perhaps next time I come, I'll come in the summer and I'll come after you've had your general election. And I do feel that I'm visiting Helsinki today at a very opportune moment. It's a big moment in Finnish politics because the True Finns are rising steadily up in the polls and, as I sense, causing horror and consternation amongst your own professional political class. But I also come at an opportune time because the project of economic and monetary union, the euro, is now in such a deep crisis that it isn't just bad for countries like you, who are having to pick up the bill and will go on having to pay that bill. It's also increasingly becoming a disaster for those countries that are trapped within it. Now, I know that your history is one where you've struggled, in fact, for centuries to win your freedom and independence. You've done your battles with the Swedes and the Russians and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and in many ways your forebears had to work long and hard to establish something that really came to fruition as recently as 1917. So I'm sure this whole question of whether you're a nation and whether you govern yourselves matters here. But what is a nation and what is democracy? And democracy can't happen unless there's a demos. It can't happen unless there's a shared will. And one of the basics for that to happen is you actually have to share history, language and culture. Without that, nations find it very difficult to operate, which perhaps is one of the reasons why my least favourite country in Europe, Belgium, is having the problems that it is today. I know that I regularly get criticised for attacking Belgium, but it is worth noting that they haven't had a government now since last April. And there is no prospect of them having one. And it's because they don't have those shared bonds of language, culture and history, which clearly you in Finland do. Now, it's, if you really believe in democracy, and if you really believe in nation-state, then I would put it to you that the European Union is a massive danger to you. I haven't come here today, and I'm sure the media will be very disappointed in this, but I haven't come here today to tell you what you should do, You know, perhaps you want to remain members of this union. Perhaps you're happy with it, I don't know. But I haven't come here to bully you or tell you what you should think. But I have come here to make some arguments, and I do so from a country that's been a member of this union for very much longer than you have been. And are the citizens of Finland or Britain or France or Germany or anywhere else, frankly, happy that the government of Europe, that the people that take the big decisions are European commissioners? And some of them come from Bucharest or Budapest or Bratislava. But they are the people. They are the government of Europe. The European Commission, 27 of them, have the sole right to propose legislation within the European Union and have the sole ability thereafter to repeal that legislation. Membership of the Union means that the laws that are proposed by these people that go through the European Union system are now the laws of your country, and that there is nothing you can do in general elections in terms of voting for your own government. There is nothing your own courts can do to overrule European law. Now, I don't know what percentage of your laws are made in Brussels, but I can tell you that in Britain the figure is a stunning 75%. And often people say, Nigel, it can't be true, we don't believe you. Well, I can tell you that the former German President, Roman Herzog, conducted a study in Germany, and from 1998 to 2006, 84% of federal laws in Germany were in fact European Union directives and regulations that were transposed into German law. And what Herzog said, he said, in the face of this, it is difficult to call Germany a modern-day parliamentary democracy. So that's just how serious this whole thing is. You cannot be a democratic, sovereign nation and a full member of the European Union as it currently is today. So people talk, don't they, about the democratic deficit, about the fact that perhaps if the Parliament, if the European Parliament had a little bit more power, perhaps we could close that gap. Well, the argument that I want to put to you tonight is that the European Union isn't just undemocratic, it is actually anti-democratic. Now, why do I say that? The father of this project, Jean Monnet, was a super bureaucrat. And he was a great one for believing that you could centrally plan big economies, that you could make 10 or 20 or 30-year plans, and that parliamentary democracy was damned inconvenient. Because what happens in a parliamentary democracy is the ship is heading in that direction, and then comes a general election and a different government who decide that the ship actually should go in this direction. So for a super bureaucrat, right from the very start, he thought that the new elite, the elites that would make up the Commission in Brussels, would actually know better what was good for the peoples of Europe than they did themselves. And that is how the whole thing was set up from the very beginning. In some ways, if you think about it, it's not dissimilar, is it, to the type of thinking that we saw in the Soviet Union. You know, the people that set the Soviet Union up didn't do so wanting to do down their people, wanting to have a desperate economy. They did so believing that they were the masters and they knew what was best. So we pushed on for 40, 45 years with the institutions of Brussels gradually gaining power. But then came the moment when they decided there was no point pretending anymore. Now was the moment to launch the EU on the world stage as a superpower. And Giscard d'Estaing, if you remember, was charged with the job of drawing up a European constitution. And that constitution was put in a referendum to the peoples of France and was put in a referendum to the peoples of the Netherlands. And both of them said no. And I remember when the French voted no, and I was there in Paris on that night, I remember thinking, tremendous. Democracy, the will of the people, has killed off this constitution. And when the Dutch voted no, I thought, well, that's it. It's not just dead, it's buried as well. It'll be back to the drawing board. Perhaps we will get the kind of Europe that I want. And I say that because, and I hope the Finnish press won't do it, but often on these visits, I've been portrayed as being anti-European. I'm not anti-European. I mean, that would be moronic. I've got a German wife. I've worked for 2 French companies. and I've drunk more Rioja than most people alive in Britain today. I love Europe, but what I want is a Europe of nation states, of democratic nation states, cooperating together, trading together, agreeing minimum standards, being good next-door neighbours. And I hoped and prayed that when that second no vote came through in the referendum, that perhaps we'd get it. But it didn't happen. And they were so angry, they were so furious. They began to abuse those of us that believed in national democracy. And what did they do? They rebranded the Constitution. They called it the Lisbon Treaty. And the former Italian Prime Minister Amato said the good thing about calling it a treaty and not a constitution is it means we won't have to have any more referendums, which was deeply cynical and I think deeply anti-democratic. But of course there was one country whose constitution meant there had to be a referendum, and that was Ireland. So the Irish were the only country that had a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, and what did the Irish people say? Despite all the threats and bullying, the Irish people said no. But still, the European institutions were not prepared to accept what had been said. And there was a second referendum. And indeed, Timo and I went to Dublin, and we campaigned, and our group, the Europe of Freedom and Democracy group, we put a leaflet into every house in Ireland, warning them that if they signed up to the Lisbon Treaty, much of their sovereign independence, which in fact came just a couple of years after yours, their battle, of course, was against the English, but perhaps the less said about that, the better. But we warned them that they would lose their democracy. We warned them that they were caught up in a euro currency that didn't suit them. Well, of course, it was virtually impossible for us. The total pack of lies that the Irish people were told, the huge amounts of money, of taxpayers' money that was used to promote the yes side, meant indeed that the second time round it was a yes vote. And in all of my life, working in politics and viewing elections, I think the sheer level of bullying that the Irish people were subjected to was nothing short of a total democratic disgrace. And because those 3 million people were bullied for a second time into voting yes, we now all, across the European Union, have to accept this Lisbon Treaty. And don't be calmed by anybody that says that what we're building is a federal Europe. That's been said for years. This is not, ladies and gentlemen, a federal Europe. This, in fact, is the very reverse of that. This is a unitary, centralised form of European government that now holds its own people in such deep contempt that it chooses to ignore referendum results. It proposes never again to give people referendums. It genuinely thinks that it can become the world's biggest economic and military superpower. But you know something? It just isn't going to work. This is not the United States of America. This is not a country where people left behind their histories and started again. This is the continent of Europe, and it's a continent that we should be rather proud of, because it's a continent that has within it the most diverse languages and cultures of any time zone in the world. The beauty of Europe are the differences that exist within it. And the idea that we can have one policy, a one-size-fits-all policy that is going to work, is something that I think already has proved to be a failure. In fact, we're heading towards, with this unitary government and with this one-size-fits-all planning, we really are heading back to a form of government that we could recognise in the old Soviet Union. Indeed, many of the commissioners, of course, were apparatchiks within that system. People like Sim Kallas from Estonia, who for 20 years was a member of the Russian Communist Party. Oh, but being career politicians, they've adjusted beautifully to this new form of government based in Brussels. They don't like it, by the way, when I say that. In fact, they get very upset in the European Parliament and often start shouting at me, but honestly, it doesn't bother me. Every time we've seen a common European policy, centrally planned, run from the centre, and beyond the democratic fingertips of the peoples of Europe, we have seen failure. We've seen it, of course, with the common fisheries policy, something that is not just an economic disaster, but one of the greatest ecological disasters in the world, where fishermen all across Europe are now forced to throw back dead into our seas hundreds of thousands of tonnes of fish every single year. And it's interesting to note, isn't it, that Norway, who incredibly sensibly, in my opinion, you might not agree, but incredibly sensibly have said no to joining the European Club, have a healthy, thriving, booming fishing industry, much better sustainability in their seas, and a policy that forbids them from throwing back any fish dead. But that was the first common policy that we in Britain saw. But of course, the next really big common policy was the one that emerged during the 1990s, and I'm talking, of course, about the creation of the euro. Now, all I can say is thank goodness that in the United Kingdom, despite the fact that a majority of our politicians wanted to sign us up to the euro, there was a big campaign in Britain, led very much by businesses and trading companies, and we managed to escape the clutches of the euro. There were also just two countries in Europe, your relatively near neighbours of Denmark and Sweden. They were the only two countries that had a referendum specifically on joining the euro, and of course both of them said no. You weren't given the choice, were you? You weren't given a free and fair referendum in Finland as to whether you should give up your currency and join an economic and monetary union. You were forced into it by your career politicians. Now, right from the start, going back in fact as early as 1990, it was the issue of the creation of the euro that got me involved in politics. I wasn't in politics before. I never intended to be in politics. I worked in the City of London, I worked in commodities, in finance and in trade. But I thought from the start that a one-size-fits-all interest rate across the diverse economies of Europe could never, ever work. That what was happening here was we were setting up a single currency as a means of leading on to a full political union. And there were economists, certainly in Germany and certainly in the Netherlands, who from the start said that countries like Greece should never, ever have joined. But because of the greed and stupidity of their own politicians, because the people in those countries, like you, were not given the choice, all these countries were forced together at the early part of this decade into this new economic and monetary union. And for the peripheral players on the fringe, for the Irelands, the Portugals, even the Spains, what joining the euro meant was that interest rates were about half the level they should have been for the first 7 or 8 years of the euro. And what it led to is the most ludicrous consumer boom, the most ridiculous property boom, an excess of cheap credit. And now, when it's turned the other way, we find those countries stuck in the most desperate, and I'm going to argue tonight, dangerous position. You know, if this meeting was taking place in Greece, and if we talked about the fact that now the Greeks have no control, not just over their own interest rates, but they have no control over their own budget, because their budget is now set by the Herman Van Rompuys of this world, another great close personal friend of mine, if any of you watch YouTube may know. You've reached a position in Greece where it is now obvious to people that it is completely irrelevant how you vote in domestic Greek elections. It doesn't matter whether you have a Conservative government in Greece or a Socialist government in Greece, because they have no power over the Greek economy. They are not the masters of their own destiny anymore. And that is dangerous because democracy acts wonderfully as a safety valve. You may not like the government that's in office, but what you do is you resolve that at the next election you'll help another party with a different manifesto. It's the essence of democracy. It isn't just about who you put in government, it's about you having the power to sack them and to replace them with somebody else. That in Greece has gone. So if voting doesn't change anything, then all you're left with is civil disobedience or civil disorder. And I think we are seeing, in Greece, the early stages of something that, unless they bust out of the euro, I think could become really, really serious civil insurgency that could perhaps lead on to something even worse than that. That is just, ladies and gentlemen, how dangerous, how mad, how crazy this European project is. What it is doing right across Europe, it is robbing nation states of their identity. It is robbing nation states of their ability to be the masters of their own destiny. And those countries are in terrible trouble. Your position, of course, by comparison, is rather better. Now, all you've got to do is to pay the bill. So I'm sure you're all very happy with that. You've got to pay the bill. The Germans will go on having to pay the bill. And I would have thought that at some point, sense must prevail, and we must realise that we simply can't have countries like Finland and countries like Greece together in the same monetary union. You know, these bailouts have woken everybody up. And the reality is that whether you're the payers or the payees, you are now all trapped in something. You're trapped inside something which is effectively an economic prison. In the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they used to call it the Volkerkerker, a prison of nations. And that literally is what people are now stuck in inside this euro. Now, there's only one good thing about all of this, and that is that public opinion across the EU has woken up. And if you look at the European Commission's own barometer poll, which comes out once every 6 months, we now see that less than 50% of people across the entire Union think that the Union is a good idea. And I put it to you that that is why parties like UKIP in the United Kingdom, that is why parties like the True Finns here are beginning to do extraordinarily well. Because our career, professional, political classes have let us down very badly indeed. They've betrayed our democracy. They've betrayed our nations. They've signed us up to something which is expensive. They've signed us up to something which, frankly, isn't far short of being outright fraudulent. And isn't it delightful that the Court of Auditors of the European Union haven't even signed off their own accounts for the last 16 years in a row, and yet still we're supposed to pour in money? No, I'm optimistic, because I feel that we've reached a moment where over the course of the next few years, these movements like Timo's, movements like mine, are going to become so big and strong that the political elite will not be able to ignore them. And the only way they'll be able to buy us off, the only way they'll be able to attempt to try and neuter these movements, is to make sure that we do have free and fair referendums so that we can decide our own futures. I hope we get a democratic solution to all of this, because if we don't get a democratic solution to it, then the kind of thing that is happening in Greece, we're in danger of seeing almost everywhere else. I want to live in a Europe where we trade together, we cooperate together, we're free together. I don't want to live in a Europe of Barroso, Van Rompuy and the European Commission, and I know that a growing number of you feel the same way. I'm delighted to be here for a couple of days. I wish the True Finns every success in your forthcoming elections. I hope you here too can make real history. Thank you.
I have lived in your future, and it didn't work.